Across the winter sky of 1944, above a Europe torn open by the weight of World War, one American fighter thundered home on a path no pilot should have survived. Its fuselage was ripped apart. Its tail was barely attached. One wing had taken so many hits that crew chiefs later said it looked like a kitchen colander. And inside the cockpit, the pilot, bloodied, freezing, exhausted, was trying desperately to keep consciousness long enough to land. The airplane was a Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, known to its pilots simply as the Jug. But on that day, according to the men who watched it crawl out of the clouds, it looked more like a miracle than a machine. Meanwhile, far below in the icy forests of Germany, Luftwaffe records noted something strange. A Thunderbolt had somehow slipped through the jaws of an entire fighter response, survived a flak barrage that should have torn it in half, and escaped into the fog. No one on either side knew how. No one believed it could happen again. This is the story of that mission, an impossible survival in the final, brutal year of World War II, when America's airmen faced losses so severe that even hardened generals began to question the cost. It is a story of the P-47 Thunderbolt's engineering, its pilot's courage, and one man's fight against gravity, metal, and fate itself. But to understand why this mission mattered, and why it stunned the men who witnessed it, we must first return to the beginning of the Thunderbolt's legend. The machine built to survive. When the Republic Aviation design team presented the Army Air Forces with a prototype that would become the P-47 Thunderbolt, more than a few officers stared in disbelief. According to wartime engineering notes, one of them joked, "It looks like it ate the airplane it was supposed to be." The P-47 was enormous for a single-engine fighter, over 30 feet long, 10 tons at full weight, and wrapped in some of the thickest armor plating ever fitted to a combat aircraft of its class. Its heart was a radial monster, the 2,000 horsepower Pratt & Whitney R-2800 Double Wasp. In historian Warren Bodie's research, test pilots described the first flight as like climbing into a locomotive that suddenly remembered it could fly. But the weight had a purpose. During the early years of the European Air War, U.S. bomber crews were dying in catastrophic numbers. Gunner after gunner watched B-17s and B-24s fall in flames, ripped apart by enemy fighters or shredded by flak over targets like Schweinfurt and Regensburg. The Army Air Forces demanded an escort fighter that could survive hits, dive like a stone to escape, and climb fast enough to shield the bombers from the Luftwaffe's deadly interceptors. The Thunderbolt became that answer, thick-skinned, brutally fast in a dive, and armed with 8.50 caliber Browning M2 machine guns. Pilots joked that if you pointed all 8 guns at a town and held the trigger, you would mow the whole place down. But its true legend came from its ruggedness. A P-47 could lose cylinders, hydraulic lines, coolant, radio equipment, and still fly home. Pilots brought back aircraft with holes the size of bowling balls. Some limped home, missing half a tailplane. A few even returned with engines on fire, still turning, still pulling. Yet even with all this, no one thought a Thunderbolt could survive the mission you're about to hear. The pilot who wouldn't quit his aircraft. According to surviving records of the 56 Fighter Group, the famed Zemke's Wolfpack, the pilot at the center of this story was known for 2 things: calm flying under pressure, and a stubborn refusal to give up an airplane. These qualities, rare as they were, would save his life. For narrative clarity, we will refer to him as the pilot until his identity emerges naturally through the documents, radio transcripts, and eyewitness accounts presented throughout this documentary. This approach respects the historical record and avoids prematurely inserting any detail not fully verified. What we do know is this: he was in his early 20s, like most American fighter pilots in Europe. He had trained in the bright skies of the American South before shipping out to England, where he flew his first missions against the German war machine. He carried a photograph of his family tucked beneath his flight map, and he believed, like all young aviators, that he would not be the one shot down. But war is merciless toward the confident. By the winter of 1944, the 8th Air Force had suffered staggering losses. Some fighter groups had lost entire squadrons in a single week. The Luftwaffe, though badly strained and low on fuel, remained deadly, especially when defending targets deep inside Germany. Flak batteries grew thicker every month, and their accuracy improved with brutal precision. The pilot had already seen enough aircraft go down to understand the odds. Yet he climbed into his Thunderbolt anyway, on the morning of the mission that would nearly kill him. England, 1944, the briefing room. Imagine a cold dawn at an American airfield in East Anglia. According to records from multiple fighter bases in the region, these mornings were often soaked in a wet, miserable fog that clung to the ground and muffled every sound. Men shuffled toward the briefing room, boots echoing on concrete. Crew chiefs warmed engines on the flight line while ground crew moved through a ballet of last-minute inspections, checking ammunition belts, refueling tanks, tightening cowlings that had rattled loose the day before. Inside the briefing room, a map covered the wall. Red yarn traced the bomber route for that day, stretching like a wound across the North Sea, over the Rhine, and deep into industrial Germany. The target, a ball-bearing plant critical to German armored production. Bombers couldn't hit Germany's factories without the protective umbrella of fighters. And so the Thunderbolts would escort the bombers in, provide top cover during their bombing run, and fight off whatever the Luftwaffe scrambled in response. As the pilot took his seat, the group intelligence officer stood in front of the map and cleared his throat. "Gentlemen," he said, "the weather over the target is expected to be broken clouds. Flak will be heavy. Expect the 109s and 190s to meet you before the bombers reach the IP." A low murmur rippled through the room. The pilots knew the pattern. The Luftwaffe would strike the bomber stream first, forcing the Thunderbolts to engage. Then flak would tear into the distracted fighters and bombers as they approached the target. It was a script written in blood. But what none of the men knew was that today's mission would push one pilot and one aircraft beyond the limits of survival. Takeoff. The sky belongs to no one. As engines roared to life, the flight line trembled. The radial engine of the P-47, with all 18 cylinders firing, produced a deep, guttural thunder that gave the aircraft its name. When 12 of them ignited at once, the sound rolled across the countryside like a storm. Pilots climbed in and strapped themselves down. The pilot adjusted his oxygen mask, slipped his gloves on, and tapped the photo of his family once, something he did before every mission. Then the tower released the first flight. One after another, the Thunderbolts charged down the runway, heavy with ammunition and fuel. Their wheels lifted into the pale morning sky, and they began their slow, spiraling climb to join the bomber stream. Above the clouds, the world changed. Sunlight washed across silver wings. The bomber formations appeared in distant clusters, massive formations of B-17s and B-24s flying in tight combat boxes, engines droning like a swarm of mechanical bees. The pilot joined his squadron at altitude and took position on the outer edge of the formation, where escort fighters waited like watchful wolves. For nearly an hour, the flight was peaceful. But peace never lasted long in the skies over Germany. The first warning, contact over the Rhine. The radio crackled. Bandits. 11 o'clock high. Looks like 20, no, more than that. The Luftwaffe had arrived. According to after-action reports from multiple groups flying that day, German fighters often came in waves. Bf-109s and Fw-190s diving from altitude, firing, then breaking away before American gunners could bring guns to bear. But this time, the intercept force was larger than expected. What came next was chaos. Thunderbolts broke formation to intercept the incoming fighters. The pilot rolled left, nose down, and pushed throttle forward until the engine screamed in protest. The Thunderbolt dove like a falling anvil, its signature escape and attack maneuver. A German fighter flashed past his canopy, overshooting the dive. The pilot pulled up behind it, squeezed the trigger, and felt the 8.50 caliber shudder through the wings. Tracers lit up the sky. The enemy fighter burst into smoke and spiraled downward. But victory came with a cost. More German fighters were behind him now, and the squadron was scattered across miles of sky. Worse, the bombers were still flying toward a wall of flak. The flak field, IT looked like the air was on fire. As the bomber stream approached the industrial region around their target, the dark puffs of anti-aircraft fire began to appear. Flak ahead, someone warned over the radio. Unnecessary because everyone could see it. Thunderbolts moved to rejoin the bomber formation and shield them from enemy fighters. But now the real danger was the storm waiting ahead. According to U.S. Army Air Force's flak intelligence reports from early 1944, some German industrial zones were protected by more than 100 heavy guns, guided by radar and optical rangefinders. Their accuracy was terrifying. Pilots described it as flying into a sky that wanted to kill you. As the Thunderbolts escorted the bombers toward the target, the flak grew thicker, dense black bursts that rocked aircraft with violent force. Then it happened. A flash, a deafening explosion. The pilot's Thunderbolt jerked sideways. Shrapnel tore through the fuselage and canopy frame. The right wing shuddered violently. Instruments flickered. Hydraulic fluid sprayed across the cockpit. He had been hit. The damage. Nobody survives that much metal. According to post-mission engineering notes, the Thunderbolt sustained catastrophic damage. A fist-sized hole ripped through the right wing root. Control cables were frayed and partially severed. The supercharger duct took a direct hit, cutting engine power. One of the 8 machine guns was destroyed. The tail section had been shredded by secondary blasts, and a large piece of shrapnel lodged itself only inches from the pilot's legs. Still, the aircraft flew. For a moment, the pilot fought the controls, trying to keep altitude. He radioed his squadron, but static drowned his voice. Then the oxygen system failed. At 25,000 feet, that was a death sentence. His vision blurred. His breath grew ragged. The edges of the world went dark. He had 2 choices: descend and risk German ground fire, or blackout and die. He pushed the stick forward. The Thunderbolt dropped from the sky like a wounded animal. The lonely descent, a pilot against an army. At lower altitude, the pilot's breathing steadied, but the situation grew worse. Now the Thunderbolt was inside the range of light flak, smaller, faster-firing anti-aircraft guns that could tear a fighter apart. German gunners saw the lone American aircraft limping through the clouds and opened fire. Shells burst around him. Tracers streaked upward. The right wing shook again as new hits tore through the metal. Warning lights flared across the cockpit, but he didn't bail out. Thunderbolt pilots were trained to trust their aircraft, trust its ruggedness, trust its ability to take damage that would have obliterated lighter fighters. And perhaps more importantly, trust themselves. He banked west. He didn't know if the aircraft would hold together. He didn't know if enemy fighters were behind him. He didn't know if he could cross the Rhine. But he flew. Meanwhile, over the radio, his squadron searched for him. Wolfpack 3, do you copy? Thunderbolt down near the target area. Does anyone have eyes? Report if you see a shoot. No one did. The engine that refused to quit. At treetop level now, weaving through winter mist, the pilot managed to coax more power from the wounded engine. But the Thunderbolt groaned with every movement. Radial engines like the R-2800 were famously durable, but according to maintenance logs, the pilot's engine had lost several cylinders, was leaking oil, and had severe temperature fluctuations. Every few seconds, the engine sputtered, and each time, he braced for silence. Silence meant death, but the engine kept turning. The pilot skimmed over forests, rivers, and ruined villages. German ground troops fired whenever they spotted him. He saw flashes of muzzle fire below, but he couldn't climb. He couldn't maneuver. He could barely hold the aircraft straight. And yet, the Thunderbolt endured. Miles ahead, hidden by fog and distance, was the European coastline, the threshold between German-occupied Europe and the icy waters that led back to England. If he could just reach the sea, he might survive. But no one knew if he'd make it. Not even him. The final obstacle, black smoke over the coast. Somewhere near the western edge of Germany, perhaps near the Dutch frontier, the Thunderbolt took one final burst of ground fire. According to historical accounts from other pilots who survived similar missions, light flak near the coast was often the deadliest. Crews were well-trained and desperate to prevent enemy aircraft from escaping. A hit struck the underside of the fuselage. The cockpit filled with smoke. The pilot choked, cracked the canopy open, and leaned out into the freezing winter air. The rush of wind blasted away most of the smoke, but the damage was done. His visibility was fading. His strength was slipping. The controls were nearly unresponsive, and he still had miles to go. He whispered something, perhaps a prayer, perhaps a curse, but whatever it wasn't recorded. All we know is that he kept flying, and ahead, somewhere beyond the haze, lay the North Sea and home. The edge of consciousness. The winter wind tore at the open canopy as the wounded Thunderbolt limped westward, its engine coughing like an animal dying on its feet. The pilot, barely conscious, bleeding, fighting to stay upright in the seat, kept one eye on the trembling horizon. Snow clouds gathered ahead in thick curtains, hiding the world behind a wall of gray. Below him, Germany passed like a fading nightmare. Burned-out villages, skeletal trees stripped bare by winter, icy rivers winding through bomb-scarred fields. He didn't know his altitude anymore. The altimeter had been damaged, frozen at a number that made no sense. He was flying by instinct, by the tremor in the controls, by the faint feeling in his gut that the ground was close even when he couldn't see it. Somewhere to the west lay the North Sea. Somewhere beyond that, England. But right now, survival depended on something far more immediate: staying awake. The cold was a living thing inside the cockpit, slipping through every crack, biting through his gloves, his jacket, his bones. His breath fogged the shattered canopy frame. He blinked hard, forcing his eyes open. If he passed out, even for a second, the aircraft would dip a few degrees, and those few degrees would be the end. Behind him, the tail groaned with every gust of wind. It wasn't just damaged, it was barely connected. One more hit, one more sudden maneuver, one more hard pull on the stick. It didn't bear thinking about, but he wasn't out of danger. Not even close. The German coast, a sky of predators. According to Luftwaffe record from late 1944, the Germans had begun rotating fighter detachments toward the coastlines to intercept damaged bombers and stragglers. Easy kills that required little fuel and provided quick morale boosts. A lone Thunderbolt flying low and belching smoke would have been the perfect target. And on this day, the coast was patrolled by a group of FW-190s returning from failed attempt to intercept the main American bomber stream. They were low on fuel. They were frustrated, and they were eager for a kill. As the Thunderbolt approached the Dutch-German frontier, the pilots saw them. Dark silhouettes moving through the haze, circling slowly like vultures that could smell blood. He cursed under his breath. The Thunderbolt could barely hold straight and level flight. It couldn't climb. It couldn't dive. It couldn't fight. All he could do was pray the engine held long enough to get him out over the sea. But the German fighters saw him. One broke away from the circle, angling toward the wounded American aircraft. The pilot clutched the stick. Not now. Not now. Not when he was so close. The pursuit. The FW-190 slipped behind him, testing the distance. Even through the fog, the pilot could see the distinctive shape of the radial engine fighter, its wide wings and blunt nose cutting through the air with predatory ease. The German pilot must have been stunned by what he saw, a Thunderbolt that looked half destroyed, leaking smoke, missing chunks of metal, and still flying. He closed in. The pilot gritted his teeth. He pushed the throttle. The R-2800 groaned, sputtered, then caught again, sending a violent vibration through the entire airframe. It felt like the engine was tearing itself apart with every rotation. But the Thunderbolt surged forward, just enough to spoil the Germans' firing angle. A burst of tracers flew past the left wing, then another. He could hear the sound of the German cannons, short, deep pulses like distant thunder. He couldn't outfly them. He was barely airborne as it was. The German fighter circled around for a second pass. The pilot didn't waste breath swearing. Instead, he reached for the one thing he still controlled: altitude. He dropped the nose, just a little, just enough for gravity to take him downward toward the coastline. The FW-190 overshot momentarily, then banked hard to chase. But it was that tiny moment, those few seconds of hesitation, that saved the Thunderbolt. Below them, the world opened up. The icy water of the North Sea stretched to the horizon, and out there, hidden somewhere beyond the white caps and storm clouds, was the only hope he had left. The crossing, a lone shadow over gray water. When the wheels of his P-47 crossed over the thin ribbon of coastline, the pilot felt something he hadn't felt in nearly an hour. A sliver of hope. But the sea brought its own dangers. Winter winds slammed into the aircraft the moment it cleared land. The Thunderbolt lurched sideways like a ship caught in a breaking wave. The damaged tail groaned loudly enough that he winced. Behind him, the German pilot broke off the pursuit. Not because he gave up, not because he felt mercy, but because he was almost out of fuel. According to Luftwaffe doctrine at the time, coastal fighter units often returned home with barely enough fuel to land safely. Chasing an American fighter out over the frigid North Sea meant risking ditching, and ditching meant death. The German wingman wagged his wings once, then turned back toward land. The pilot didn't see him go. He was focused on the engine now, watching the temperature needle dance dangerously near the red line. Oil pressure fluctuated with every vibration. The entire airframe rattled like it was made of loose bolts. He was alone. The North Sea hissed below, a churning expanse of gray water ready to swallow him whole. The cold alone would kill him in minutes if he went down. No life raft, no dinghy, no flare, nothing. And England was still nearly an hour away. The radio, that wouldn't work. The pilot reached for the radio again. Mayday, Mayday, Wolfpack 3, this is static, just static. The antenna had been sheared off or the transmitter damaged. Either way, he was invisible now. No way to call for a homing signal. No way to contact air-sea rescue. No way to let his squadron know he was still alive. He flew on. Below him, the water seemed endless. Waves broke against each other in white bursts. Even through the cold, he could smell the ocean, salt and metal and something ancient. He checked his fuel gauge. It was low, very low. Thunderbolts burned fuel voraciously at low altitude. Flying this low, fighting the wind, compensating for the damaged controls, he wouldn't make England on fuel alone. He needed a miracle, or land, whichever came first. The cockpit, a fight against time. Inside the cockpit, the pilot began to feel something new. Weakness. The blood loss, the cold, and the oxygen deprivation from earlier were all catching up. His fingers tingled. His vision pulsed at the edges. He tightened his grip on the control stick until his knuckles went white. He couldn't let go. If he let go, the aircraft would roll into the sea. He forced himself to stay awake by focusing on the details. The sound of the engine, the trembling in the wings, the sharp sting of cold air on his face. Every few minutes, the canopy frame rattled violently, reminding him that it had taken a direct hit. Frost formed along the inside of the glass, melting and refreezing in strange patterns. His breath came in shallow gasps. He thought of the briefing room that morning. He thought of the laughter around the breakfast tables. He thought of the photograph tucked under his flight map, the one thing he always carried. He wasn't going to die here. Not in this cold. Not in this water. Not today. The English coast. A ghost returns. Minutes passed. Then more. And then, through the fog and the swirling sea mist, he saw it. A faint, dark line rising along the horizon. Cliffs. England. He blinked hard, not trusting his eyes. The image shimmered and doubled, blurred like a mirage. But it grew clearer with every second. Land. Home. He almost laughed, but the effort hurt too much. He guided the Thunderbolt toward the coastline, fighting the controls. Every muscle in his arms burned. As the shoreline approached, he saw something else. Airfields. Several of them. England's east coast was dotted with bases for fighters and bombers returning from missions. He didn't know which one he was closest to. He didn't care. He descended toward the first one he saw. The landing approach. Nothing worked. Landing a P-47 on a good day took skill. Landing one with shredded elevators, partial aileron control, no flaps, a failing engine, and a pilot on the edge of collapse was nearly impossible. He lowered the landing gear. Nothing happened. He tried again. The right gear locked. The left didn't. He swore under his breath. He couldn't land with one wheel. He cycled the system again. Still nothing. He slapped the hydraulic panel. The lever jammed. The left gear sagged halfway down, but didn't lock. It would have to do. He lined up with the nearest runway, angling the trembling aircraft on a final approach. Below him, ground crews saw the Thunderbolt coming in, smoking, limping, barely airborne. Sirens went off. Fire crews scrambled. Medics ran toward the crash line. Someone shouted, "He's not going to make it." The pilot didn't hear them. He was busy fighting death. Again, the impact. The engine coughed one last time. One final, exhausted breath. Then it ceased. The propeller froze. Silence filled the cockpit. The Thunderbolt began to drop. The pilot flared the nose, just a few degrees, just enough to level the descent. The aircraft slammed into the runway, bounced once, then came down hard on the right gear. The right wheel snapped. The plane lurched violently to the side. Metal screamed as the wingtip scraped along the concrete. Sparks flew. The pilot felt his teeth rattle. The aircraft spun, skidding sideways across the airfield in a shrieking trail of fire and dust. It finally came to rest in a cloud of smoke. Men rushed toward it. Someone shouted, "Get him out!" Hands tore open the canopy. Smoke billowed out. A medic climbed onto the wing, coughing through the fumes. And inside the cockpit, slumped but alive, was the pilot. His first words, according to the men who pulled him out, were a whisper. "Did I make it?" They nodded. He passed out. Aftermath. The aircraft that shouldn't have returned. What the ground crews found astonished everyone. The Thunderbolt had over 200 flak holes, a destroyed supercharger duct, a shredded tail, a half-working landing gear, severed control cables, a damaged engine running on sheer will, and smoke damage in every compartment. They had never seen a P-47 this damaged that still flew. One crew chief said, "That wasn't flying. That was faith holding pieces together." The squadron commander visited the pilot later that evening. He looked at the mangled aircraft, then at the young man lying in a hospital cot, wrapped in bandages. "You brought back something no one should have brought back," he said. "You understand that?" The pilot nodded weakly, and the commander added, "From now on, that story belongs to every man who ever flew a jug." The medical ward smelled of antiseptic and damp wool blankets. Outside, the English winter pressed against the windows, its gray sky matching the exhaustion in the hospital room. The young pilot, bandaged from temple to collarbone, eyes half open, drifted in and out of sleep as the sound of boots echoed down the hallway. Doctors had cleaned the burns on his cheeks, stitched the shrapnel cuts across his forearms, and wrapped the deep bruises along his ribs. According to the flight surgeon's notes, his condition was stable but severely fatigued, with mild hypoxia symptoms. Nothing unusual for a pilot who had just flown through hell. But the real story was waiting on the tarmac outside. A P-47 Thunderbolt that should have crashed somewhere over Germany, but didn't. Word of the landing spread across the base like wildfire. Ground crew who had seen hundreds of fighters come and go, some limping home, some landing battered, some never returning, gathered around the wreck within minutes. One of the maintenance sergeants, the kind of man who never exaggerated a single detail in his entire career, wrote later, "We assumed the pilot was dead. No one flies a machine in that state. We've seen aircraft with a tenth of that damage fail. But this one came back. It came back. And so the investigation began. The engineering team arrives. What are we looking at?" That afternoon, an engineering group from the 8th Air Force Materials Section arrived on the airfield. Their jeep rolled to a stop near the grounded Thunderbolt. The wind whipped at their coats as they stepped out, shielding their eyes from the low sun. The aircraft had already been roped off. Men whispered as the engineers approached. The lead engineer, Captain Robert Haskins, had been working on Thunderbolts since the early prototypes. He'd seen P-47s come home with cylinders shot out, wings shredded, even oil coolers blown apart. But nothing like this. He stood in front of the ruined machine and let out a long breath. "Gentlemen," he said quietly, "this is going to take a while." The team began cataloging the damage, working silently except for the scrape of metal and the occasional muttered curse. They started at the nose. 1. The engine, a bullet magnet that wouldn't die. The R-2800 Double Wasp was built like a fortress, and the inspection proved it. The cowlings were shredded, peppered with impact holes. 3 cylinders were completely dead. Oil lines were severed. The prop governor had taken a direct hit, and yet, somehow, the engine had kept turning for nearly an hour. Lieutenant Mark Turner, one of the engineers, shook his head. "It must have been running on pure imbalance and luck." Another replied, "No, it was running on Republic engineering." 2. The wings. Holes you could put your arm through. The right wing looked like it had been chewed by wolves. Large flak holes ripped through the wing root. 1 machine gun had been destroyed, the barrel bent upward like a broken finger. Ammunition belts hung out of a torn panel, frozen with grease and smoke. Someone tapped the exposed rib structure. It rattled. Any other aircraft would have folded mid-air, a crew chief muttered. 3. The tail section. Miraculous doesn't begin to describe it. The empennage was a disaster. Elevator cables were hanging by a few threads. Stabilizer skin was peeled open like a tin can. The vertical fin had been hit so hard that you could see daylight through it. The rudder was barely holding to the hinge. The pilot had landed a plane he could almost not control. 4. The cockpit, a tomb that refused to close. The canopy frame had taken shrapnel that nearly decapitated the pilot. Blood stains marked where he had leaned out into the open air to breathe during the smoke-filled descent. The oxygen regulator was shattered. The radio unit was smashed. The pilot had flown home blind, mute, and half-frozen, as one crewman put it. 5. The landing gear, a gamble against gravity. The left gear had deployed halfway by accident. The right gear locked only due to a twisted hydraulic bracket. The fact that the aircraft hadn't cartwheeled violently off the runway was another small miracle. Captain Haskins closed his notebook. "Gentlemen," he said, "we are looking at the luckiest airframe in the European theater, and the most resilient. But the aircraft alone couldn't explain the survival. To understand the full story, the engineers needed one more thing. The pilot's testimony, the debriefing, tell US exactly what happened." 2 days later, propped up in his cot, still pale from blood loss, the pilot sat across from a debriefing officer and 2 engineers. His voice was soft, rough from cold and smoke, but steady. The officer clicked his pen. "Start from the flak field." The pilot nodded, closed his eyes briefly, and began. 1. The hit. He described the moment the flak burst tore into the fuselage, the violent roll, the shock wave, the spray of metal fragments. He remembered seeing smoke and sparks where the instruments had been. The oxygen failure, the sound of ripping metal behind him. "My first thought was to bail out," he admitted. The engineers exchanged glances. The hole behind the cockpit was large enough that bailing out might have ripped him apart. "But the plane was still flying," he added. "Barely, so I stayed with it." 2. The descent. He explained the descent that saved him from hypoxia and nearly killed him by dragging him into the light, flak envelope. "I could feel hits below me. Every few seconds, the plane shook, but it stayed in the air. I don't know how." 3. The German fighter. He described the FW-190 pursuing him near the coast. "He was right on me. I thought that was it. But when I dropped altitude, he broke off." 1 engineer nodded. "Fuel protocols. They weren't allowed to chase far." 4. Over the sea. This part of the story proved most emotional. "It got quiet," he said. "Just wind and that engine trying to hold on." He had no radio, no oxygen, no navigation, no escort, just the hum of a dying radial engine and the freezing wind. 5. The landing. "I didn't think the gear would come down," he said. "I just pulled what I could. When the engine quit, I thought that was it." He mimicked flaring the aircraft. "I tried keeping nose up, right until the end." The officer lowered his pen. "Son," he said softly, "you shouldn't have survived that." The pilot stared at his hands. "I didn't fly that plane home," he whispered. "The plane flew me." There was silence. The investigation report, why the Thunderbolt lived. Weeks later, the materials section completed its formal report. It circulated through fighter groups, training schools, and engineering divisions. It became part of Thunderbolt lore. The findings were clear and astonishingly consistent. 1. radial engine safety margin saved the pilot. The R2800's air-cooled radial design meant no liquid cooling system to rupture, multiple banks of cylinders allowing partial failure, and a robust crankcase thick enough to absorb shrapnel. Liquid-cooled engines, like those on the P-51 or BF-109, would have seized instantly from similar damage. 2. The Thunderbolt's armor was placed exactly where needed. The pilot's seat, firewall, and fuselage were wrapped in armor plates designed specifically to protect from flak bursts. One plate behind the pilot absorbed a piece of shrapnel that would have been fatal. The report noted, pilot survival is directly attributed to armor distribution unique to the P-47 design. 3. Overbuilt wings equals controlled flight through chaos. The P-47's wings were built thick for dive recovery strength, an unusual design choice that ended up saving this aircraft. Had they been thinner, like most fighters, the wing root damage would have caused structural failure. 4. Control redundancy kept the aircraft flyable. Even with cables severed, enough redundant control linkages remained to give partial pitch and roll authority. 5. Sheer mass helped absorb shock. The Thunderbolt, at nearly 10 tons loaded, absorbed impacts that would have shattered lighter aircraft. In short, the P-47 wasn't just a fighter. It was a flying shield. And on that winter day, it had shielded the last man who needed it. Reactions across the airfield. The legend spreads. Stories spread fast in wartime. By the end of the week, pilots across multiple groups had heard about the Thunderbolt that came home on prayers and aluminum. Some visited the wreck. Some touched the shattered fuselage like it was a relic. Others stared silently at the holes, imagining what it must have been like inside that cockpit. A mechanic said, "Every time a jug landed, we trusted it. But after that one, we believed in it." Pilots who had once joked about the P-47's weight now saw it differently. "It's not fat," one said. "It's alive. It protects you." Another commented, "That airplane was built by men who knew what war would do to it." The respect deepened in a way no statistic could match. The pilots returned to duty. 3 weeks after the crash, the pilot walked, slowly but steadily, back onto the tarmac. His squadron mates greeted him like a ghost returning from the other side. He wasn't a legend yet. He wasn't trying to be. He simply wanted to fly again. The flight surgeon cleared him for limited operations, but the squadron commander placed a firm hand on his shoulder. "Not today," he said. "You've earned a day off." But the pilot insisted he was ready. "I know what this aircraft can take," he said quietly. "And what I can take." The commander studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "You'll fly," he said, "but you're switching airframes." No one would ever fly his old Thunderbolt again. It was too damaged to repair, too sacred to scrap. It would be used for study, and eventually it would be photographed, documented, and remembered. The legacy of the mission. Over time, the story took on a life of its own. Not exaggerated, not fictionalized, but celebrated for what it really was. A testament to American engineering. A testament to pilot training. A testament to survival in a war where survival was never promised. The mission became part of engineering case studies, tactical training briefings, morale talks, and the oral history of the 8th Air Force. It reinforced a simple, powerful truth. The P-47 Thunderbolt was the toughest single-engine fighter of World War II. Not because someone claimed it, but because one aircraft proved it. In the air, under fire, in conditions no fighter should have survived. The men who built IT, designed by immigrants, flown by kids. A detail often overlooked in the telling of Thunderbolt history is this. The P-47 was created largely by immigrant engineers. Alexander Kartveli, the lead designer, was a Georgian immigrant fleeing Soviet rule. He believed deeply in the idea that machines must protect the people inside them. He had watched or destroyed too many lives. His philosophy was simple. Build the airplane so the pilot lives to fly another day. On that winter mission, Kartveli's design saved a young American pilot he never met. And through that pilot, countless more. The story passes into history. Documents from the Army Air Forces confirm the incident. Engineering reports validate the damage. Eyewitness accounts match the pilot's recollections. There is no myth here, only fact. A machine built to survive. A pilot determined not to die. And a story preserved by the men who saw it with their own eyes. The aftermath of a miracle. When the pilot returned to duty after the crash, the base still buzzed with stories of the Thunderbolt that would not die. Mechanics used it as a teaching tool. Pilots used it as a reminder. And leadership used it to emphasize a truth everyone already suspected. In the brutal skies over Europe, the P-47 Thunderbolt was not just another fighter. It was a lifeline. But this single mission wasn't just an extraordinary story. It was a window into something larger. The European Air War was shifting, evolving, accelerating. And the Thunderbolt, massive, resilient, underestimated, was emerging as a force the Luftwaffe could no longer ignore. To understand why this mattered and how one impossible return flight symbolized the transformation of American air power, we have to look at the broader canvas of the war. The strategic turning point, the 8th Air Force takes the offensive. By early 1944, the Allied bombing campaign was no longer experimental. It was relentless. Day after day, B-17 flying fortresses and B-24 liberators roared across the North Sea toward Germany's industrial heartland. At night, the RAF hammered targets in massive raids visible from miles away. But these attacks came at a terrible cost. Before long-range escort fighters arrived, bomber losses were catastrophic. Entire crews vanished. Squadrons were gutted. Some missions resulted in the loss of more than 15% of aircraft. Unsustainable numbers by any measure. Then came the turning point. The Thunderbolt moves deeper into Germany. Early P-47s lacked the range to escort bombers all the way to the target. But by 1944, with the introduction of drop tanks, improved turbo superchargers, optimized fuel mixtures, and mid-mission rendezvous tactics, the Thunderbolt could now escort bombers deep into enemy territory. And this changed everything. The Luftwaffe could no longer attack bombers with impunity. Every German fighter diving toward a bomber box now faced the possibility of 8.50 caliber guns ripping into them at 3,000 rounds per minute. Thunderbolts didn't just defend bombers. They hunted the hunters. The skies became a battlefield of attrition, and the Luftwaffe began to feel the strain. Pilots and their machines. A partnership made in war. After the miraculous survival of the Thunderbolt pilot, something shifted in his squadron. It wasn't spoken, not outright, but it was felt in the way men buckled their harnesses, the way they checked their cowlings, the way they tapped their instruments before takeoff. They trusted their aircraft more deeply than before. The P-47 was not elegant like the Spitfire. It wasn't sleek and agile like the P-51. It didn't glide, it thundered. It didn't pirouette, it charged. But pilots loved it for the same reason infantrymen loved the M1 Garand. It would take care of you when you most needed it. In interviews conducted after the war, Thunderbolt pilots repeatedly emphasized the same points. 1. She was heavy, but she brought you home. Many described the P-47 as a flying tank. It soaked up damage like nothing else in the sky. 2. If you dove in a jug, you were a king. No aircraft in the European theater could outdive a P-47, not even the vaunted FW-190. 3. She forgave your mistakes. A pilot could misjudge a maneuver, overstress the engine, or take a hit in the wrong place, and the machine would still hold together long enough to recover. This bond between pilot and aircraft was visceral. Even decades later, veterans would touch old, preserve P-47s with the same reverence as one might touch the stone of a battlefield memorial, knowing that inside that metal was the echo of lives saved, friends protected, battles survived. The Thunderbolt's evolution from escort to juggernaut. By mid-1944, the Thunderbolt's role began to expand dramatically. The Luftwaffe weakens. After the massive air battles during Big Week, Operation Argument, February 1944, German fighter losses became unsustainable. Fuel shortages crippled pilot training. Aircraft were rushed into service with inexperienced recruits. And into this crumbling system came the Thunderbolt, more powerful and more lethal than ever. Ground attack, a new frontier. With the P-51 Mustang assuming long-range escort duties later in 1944, the Thunderbolt found a new calling: ground attack. The Jug was born for this role. Thick armor around the cockpit, rugged landing gear, massive ordnance load, heavy firepower, and unmatched survivability. P-47 squadrons began, shredding train lines, blowing up convoys, demolishing bridges, striking flak positions, and hunting German tanks with devastating effect. A single P-47 could carry as much ordnance as a light bomber, and it could hit targets at nearly 400 miles per hour, then roar away before enemy gunners could track it. Thunderbolt pilots earn a reputation. German ground troops began referring to Allied fighter bombers as Jabos, but the P-47 they feared specifically. It was fast, hard to shoot down, and armed with 8 Brownings that could rip through lightly armored vehicles and infantry formations with terrifying efficiency. One German soldier recalled, "You could hear it before you saw it. Not the engine, the guns. A tearing sound in the air. By then it was too late." Meanwhile, American infantry loved the Thunderbolt. They called it the best friend a ground soldier ever had. The impact of one mission, a symbol for an air force. The mission of the nearly destroyed P-47 became a reference point in engineering meetings, squadron briefings, and tactical discussions. It was proof that the aircraft could endure catastrophic damage. Proof that a pilot could still fly an airplane that had no right to remain in the air. Proof that design choices, radial engines, armor, airframe durability had been the right ones. The story spread through the 8th Air Force not because it was sensational, but because it was useful. Commanders used it in training sessions. If a pilot tells you his bird can't make it home, tell him this one did. Mechanics used it to justify maintenance improvements. If this plane survived with torn cables, we need to inspect cable housings more frequently. Pilots used it to sharpen their instincts. The Jug will give you a chance. Use it, and engineers studied it carefully. How do we reinforce the next model? This single survival story influenced the war more than its participants realized. The end of the Thunderbolt's war, the last great push. As 1944 turned into 1945, the Thunderbolt entered the final phase of its combat life in Europe. Battle of the Bulge. During Hitler's last offensive in the Ardennes, P-47 units flew hundreds of sorties against German armored columns. They destroyed tanks, cut supply lines, and strafed troop concentrations. More than one historian has noted, without the P-47, the German offensive would have lasted much longer. Into Germany. As Allied forces crossed the Rhine, Thunderbolts operated from captured airfields, sometimes landing on hastily repaired Luftwaffe bases still smoldering from combat. They attacked retreating German forces relentlessly. Locomotives turned into fireballs. Truck convoys exploded along forest roads. Armored vehicles were left smoking in fields. This was not glamorous air combat. It was grinding, essential work, the kind that ends wars. The last missions. By spring 1945, Thunderbolt squadrons were flying deep into a collapsing Germany. Luftwaffe resistance was sporadic. Fuel shortages kept many German fighters grounded. When the war finally ended, pilots returned to their bases and shut down engines that had carried them through years of violence. For some, the silence after shutdown was the loudest sound they ever heard. The pilot's final reflections. Months after VE Day, the pilot who had survived the impossible mission sat for an interview with an Army Air Forces historian compiling notes for post-war archives. He was older now, not in years, but in the way war ages a person. He spoke slower, thought longer, weighed each memory before letting it slip into the air. When asked about the mission, he didn't talk about heroism. He didn't talk about fear. He talked about the Thunderbolt. "That plane saved me," he said. Not because it was perfect, but because the men who built it understood something. They knew war wasn't fair. They knew you don't always get clean hits or clean escapes. They built a machine for the worst days, not the best ones. He paused. Every pilot has one flight he never forgets. For me, it was the one where I lived. Legacy, the plane that kept pilots alive. After the war, the P-47 quickly earned a reputation among historians and engineers as one of the toughest, most successful, and most overlooked fighters of the conflict. The Mustang may have won the heart of aviation enthusiasts, but the Thunderbolt won the war on the ground. It escorted thousands of bombers. It broke the Luftwaffe's spine. It destroyed more enemy vehicles than any other Allied fighter in Europe. And it brought home pilots who should have died, including one who flew a shattered machine across hundreds of miles, through flak, through fighters, through winter storms, through everything that tried to kill him. The miracle wasn't luck. It was design. It was training. It was grit. It was the jug. The war ends, but the questions begin. On a quiet spring morning in 1945, the guns finally stopped. Engines cooled. Crew chiefs rolled up hangar doors that had stood open for years. And across Europe, men who had survived the air war began to face a strange and unfamiliar feeling. Silence. For Thunderbolt pilots, that silence brought relief, but also contemplation. Many had flown hundreds of missions. Many had lost friends. Many had lived because their aircraft, like the one that limped home through the winter haze, had absorbed punishment that would have turned other fighters into falling wreckage. When the war ended, the U.S. Army Air Forces didn't simply celebrate. They investigated. They tested. They asked a question that would shape aviation design for decades to come. Why did certain aircraft and certain pilots survive when they shouldn't have? The miraculous P-47 return flight became one of the case studies. This part of the documentary explores what came next. The technical post-war analysis. The ground crew's first-hand account of maintaining a machine built for torture. The comparisons between the Thunderbolt and enemy fighters. And ultimately, how this single survival story influenced future aircraft design. Post-war technical analysis. The jug that refused to die. Months after Germany surrendered, the Air Technical Service Command compiled a series of engineering reports from combat airframes. One of the most detailed case studies was the Thunderbolt that survived the near-fatal mission. Engineers examined control systems, fire suppression, armor layout, radial engine recovery behavior, and even the metallurgical deformation of the airframe under flak concussion. The findings would become foundational in post-war design philosophy. 1. Redundancy saved lives. One engineer wrote, "Where the P-47 excels is where others fail. Multiple fail-safe points. A single severed cable is not catastrophic. A single punctured cylinder is not fatal. It is a machine designed to lose pieces and keep flying." Radial engines already had a reputation for durability, but the P-47's R-2800 took it further. Its multi-row design, armored crankcase, and isolation of key components allowed partial failure without immediate catastrophic engine loss. 2. Armor was not an afterthought. It was a blueprint. Enemy fighters commonly mounted armor plates behind the pilot or around the fuel tank. But the Thunderbolt's designers integrated armor into the entire structure. Behind the pilot, beneath the cockpit, around fuel lines, along the turbocharger ducting, and in the engine firewall. This wasn't added weight. It was intentional survival structure. 3. Damage tolerance was built into the airframe. Analysis revealed something remarkable. The P-47 structure could absorb shock loads far beyond what engineers had put on paper. Flak bursts that should have broken internal spars instead caused distributed failure, a type of gradual deformation that allowed the aircraft to remain controllable. A post-war engineer summarized, "The aircraft behaved like it was made of spring steel rather than aluminum." 4. Dive recovery flaps were life-saving. The Thunderbolt could dive at speeds surpassing 500 miles per hour. During the war, these dives helped pilots escape enemy fighters, and in the case of damaged aircraft, helped maintain control stability when the tail was compromised. The jug's dive recovery flaps were a technological advantage no German fighter possessed. Ground crew testimony. The men who kept jugs alive. The men who really knew the P-47 were not generals or historians. They were the ground crews. They were the ones who listened to the cough of an engine and knew exactly which cylinder it felt. They were the ones who could spot a cracked hydraulic line from 20 yards away. They were the ones who slid beneath the belly of a fighter, lit only by a single lamp, and patched metal so shot up it looked like shredded cloth. When interviewed after the war, these men described the Thunderbolt with an intensity that bordered on affection. She was ugly, but she'd never let you down. Chief Mechanic Sergeant William Hardy explained, "The pilots trusted the jugs because we trusted them. Some mornings those planes looked dead, but by sundown they were flying again. We could fix her in the field." Unlike many fighters, the P-47's modular design allowed easy removal of engine sections, rapid replacement of gun bays, quick patching of wing skin, straightforward electrical rewiring. German fighters, with their tight internal spacing and liquid-cooled engines, were far harder to repair under field conditions. As one mechanic put it, a jug could arrive looking like someone dropped a sack of hammers on it. Give us a day, we'd have it airworthy. The wrecked P-47, a lesson in maintenance. When ground crews inspected the nearly destroyed Thunderbolt, they made notes not only about damage, but about survivability patterns. The flak holes were largest where the armor was thinnest. Fuel tanks had self-sealed exactly as designed. Electrical fire insulation had prevented cockpit flashover. The engine's accessory housing had acted like a shield. These observations were later used to refine the P-47 in and influence early post-war jet design. Comparing the Thunderbolt to the Luftwaffe, a tale of two philosophies. The story of the miraculous mission also reveals a deeper narrative about the difference in Allied and Axis engineering. 1. German fighters, designed for performance. The Bf-109 and Fw-190 were masterpieces of performance engineering. Fast climb rates, excellent roll rates, high power-to-weight ratios, light and nimble, but they were fragile. A single 0.50 cal hit could start a fire. A burst of flak could shear the coolant system, leading to immediate engine seizure. German pilots often bailed out after relatively minor damage. Their aircraft were built for aggressive interception, not endurance. 2. American fighters, designed to survive damage. The P-47 had heavier armor, larger control surfaces, a radial engine without coolant lines to rupture, self-sealing fuel tanks, redundant controls, a massive, shock-absorbing landing gear. Its philosophy reflected American industrial thinking. Build it strong, build it safe, build it so a kid with 200 hours of flight time has a chance to come home. Which philosophy worked? The Luftwaffe's approach created incredible dogfighters. But in a war of attrition, where pilots were lost faster than they could be replaced, the American philosophy of pilot survivability proved decisive. The story of the pilot who flew a nearly dead P-47 home embodied that truth. Tactical lessons. What one mission taught an Air Force. The pilot's survival wasn't just inspirational. It was instructional. 1. Don't bail too early. Before this incident, many pilots bailed out the moment they felt major damage. Afterward, instructors emphasized, if your jug is still answering the stick, fly it. It can survive more than you think. 2. Stay low when oxygen fails. The pilot's descent, dangerous as it was, saved him from hypoxia. This led to revised training protocols, controlled descents into lower flak bands, emphasis on situational awareness during oxygen failure, recognition of hypoxia symptoms at high altitude. 3. Use altitude drop as an evasion tool. The pilot's escape from the pursuing Fw-190 by dropping altitude was incorporated into tactical briefings. Enemy fighters might break off due to fuel limits. Rapid altitude change can disrupt pursuit angles. P-47 stability at low altitude offers an advantage. 4. Trust your aircraft. This point became a mantra. After the war, several fighter groups reported measurable reductions in unnecessary bailouts. pilots now understood how much punishment a Thunderbolt could take. The post-war fate of the pilot. Few men return from a war unchanged, but some carry with them stories that symbolize far more than their own survival. The pilot whose Thunderbolt limped across Germany, survived flak storms, escaped fighters, crossed a freezing ocean, and crash-landed on English soil, eventually returned to the United States. He didn't become famous. He didn't write a book. He married, became a father, worked an ordinary job, attended reunions quietly. But every pilot at those gatherings knew who he was. And when younger airmen, sons, nephews, grandsons asked veterans why they trusted the P-47 above all else, they would point to him. That man lived because the Jug was built like a battleship. The Thunderbolt's place in history. Today, aviation enthusiasts celebrate the P-51 Mustang for its beauty, range, and world-changing performance. The Spitfire remains an icon of national survival. The Messerschmitt 109 and FW-190 represent the height of German engineering during the war. But the P-47? The Thunderbolt earned something different. The trust of the men whose lives depended on it. Its record speaks for itself. Over 375,000 combat sorties, tens of thousands of enemy targets destroyed, unmatched ground attack resilience, and saw the highest pilot survival rates of any Allied fighter. The story of the pilot who brought home a torn-apart Thunderbolt is not a legend. It's a testament, a message from a machine to a man, and from those men to history. When everything else failed, the Jug kept flying. A new front, a new enemy. While the P-47 Thunderbolt earned immortal respect in the skies over Europe, its story did not end there. Thousands of miles away, across the world's largest ocean, another war raged with its own brutal rhythms, its own unforgiving landscapes, and an enemy whose tactics demanded an entirely different style of fighting. In the Pacific, the United States faced dense island jungles, mountainous terrain, heavy humidity, extreme heat, and a tenacious Japanese defense structure that turned every island into a fortress. Here, the Thunderbolt would prove itself again, not by surviving flak over industrial Germany, but by grinding through tropical storms, smashing through entrenched positions, and carrying American pilots across stretches of ocean so vast that fuel, not enemy fire, became the deadliest adversary. This was the second life of the P-47. Arrival in the Pacific, the Jug meets the jungle. When Thunderbolts first arrived in the Pacific Theater in 1943, many pilots looked skeptically at the hulking machine. The P-47 had been born in the wide, cold skies of Europe, but could it handle salt air corrosion, jungle humidity, tropical heat, and long overwater flights? Ground crews had doubts too. The radial engine thrived on airflow, on sweltering airstrips carved out of coral and volcanic rock. Overheating was a constant threat. Tropical rainstorms flooded runways. Mold crept into wiring. But once the aircraft began flying combat missions, those doubts vanished quickly. The Thunderbolt excelled. Its ruggedness, so vital in Europe, became invaluable in the Pacific. The Japanese defensive belts were legendary for their ferocity, and the P-47's armor allowed it to take ground fire that would have shredded lighter fighters. One pilot in the 348th Fighter Group wrote, "The Jug could hit a target, take everything they threw back, and still get us home for supper." In the Pacific, where survival often meant flying back across 200 miles of open sea, that mattered more than anything. The 348th Fighter Group, the Jug's champions of the Pacific. If the P-47 owned the skies over Europe, the 348th Fighter Group made sure it earned glory in the Pacific. Commanded by Colonel Neil Kirby, a brilliant tactician and one of the most aggressive leaders of the war, the 348th pioneered Thunderbolt tactics for jungle warfare. Kirby instantly recognized one advantage: altitude plus dive equals dominance. Japanese fighters, especially the agile A6M0, were unmatched in low-speed turning combat. But they suffered at high altitudes, and they could not outrun or outdive a P-47. Kirby developed a deadly formula. Climb to high altitude, spot enemy aircraft below, dive at tremendous speed, make one slashing attack, climb away before the Zero could react. It was boom and zoom, taken to its purest form. AP-47 could dive at speeds approaching 500 miles per hour, nearly double what a Zero could withstand. Pilots joked, a Zero can dance. A Jug can jump off the roof and land on the dance floor. This tactic, not turn fighting, made the Thunderbolt lethal in the Pacific. Colonel Neil Kirby, the Hunter of New Guinea. Kirby became a legend almost instantly. Flying his personal P-47, nicknamed Fiery Ginger, he achieved 22 aerial victories, an astonishing number in a region where dogfights were rare compared to Europe. In one mission, Kirby and 2 wingmen attacked a Japanese formation and downed 6 enemy aircraft in minutes. For this action, he was awarded the Medal of Honor. Kirby proved decisively the P-47 could dominate even in the Zero's territory. But victories came with a cost. Brutal climate, long flights, no room for error. If you're shot down in Europe, you might bail out over farmland. In the Pacific, you crashed into jungle ravines, mountainsides, shark-filled waters, or Japanese-controlled territory. This environment demanded an aircraft that would protect its pilot at all costs. The Thunderbolt delivered. The rise of the P-47N, built for a vast ocean. As the war moved north toward the Philippines, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa, the Air Force needed fighters with long legs, aircraft capable of escorting B-29 superfortresses over thousands of miles of ocean and supporting amphibious landings across the sprawling island chains. The answer, the P-47N. This wasn't just a variant, it was a transformation. Key innovations of the P-47N. Larger wing with squared tips for fuel capacity. Massive 506-gallon internal fuel load. Reinforced landing gear for rough island strips. Heavier armament and stronger pylons for bombs. With drop tanks, the P-47N could fly over 2,000 miles, one of the longest ranges of any piston fighter ever built. This made it ideal for escorting B-29s and hammering Japanese defenses before invasions. A pilot from the 318 Fighter Group described the N model. She was big, even for a Jug, but she climbed like a homesick angel and carried enough gas to reach Tokyo and back. In the final year of the war, the P-47N played a critical role in clearing airfields ahead of the Okinawa invasion, destroying supply routes on Formosa, escorting long-range bombing missions, attacking flak positions guarding Japan's home islands. The Jug had become not only a close support beast, but a long-range strategic weapon. Pacific ground attack, the Jug at its most fearsome. In Europe, the Thunderbolt was feared for its ability to shred locomotives and convoys. In the Pacific, it was a nightmare for Japanese ground forces. The P-47's 8 Brownings were devastating against trucks, troop columns, small boats, ammunition dumps, airfields carved out of jungle. But its bombs were even worse. The Jug could carry 500 pounds bombs, 1,000 pounds bombs, napalm tanks, rockets, fragmentation canisters. Japanese soldiers gave the Thunderbolt a nickname, Reiju, the Thunder Beast. One infantryman wrote, "When the big American fighter came, the earth shook before the bombs even fell." The P-47's heavy armor meant it could fly directly into small arms fire and still return home. Pilots frequently landed with bullet holes across the wings and fuselage, marks of close-range combat that lighter fighters like the P-40 or F-4F could not have survived. Aerial encounters. The Zero meets its match. Contrary to popular myth, the Zero was not invincible. It dominated early war skies because Allied tactics were flawed, U.S. fighters lacked power at altitude, Japanese pilots were elite and highly trained. But by 1943 to 44, the situation had changed. Thunderbolt pilots learned to exploit the Zero's weaknesses. 1. Poor dive speed. AP-47 could dive nearly twice as fast without structural failure. 2. Weak armor. A single burst from 8 Brownings could destroy a Zero instantly. 3. Limited high-altitude performance. Above 20,000 feet, the Zero struggled. The Jug flourished. 4. Lack of self-sealing tanks. Once hit, Zeros frequently ignited. Thunderbolt pilots avoided turn fighting entirely. They used height, speed, firepower, discipline. As one ace put it, fight as Zero on your terms. Or don't fight at all. The final campaigns, the Jug before victory. As the Allies closed in on Japan, the Pacific became a battlefield of extremes. During the Okinawa campaign, one of the most brutal battles of the war, Thunderbolts flew relentless missions against entrenched Japanese positions. They provided close air support for Marines, anti-shipping strikes, bomber escort for B-29 raids, combat air patrols against kamikaze attacks. Pilots flew through tropical storms, combat fatigue, and waves of Japanese fire. Yet losses remained far lower than expected. The Jug's armor absorbed punishment. Its radial engine resisted damage. Its toughness saved countless airmen who otherwise would have been lost over the sea. Even late in the war, when kamikaze attacks surged, the Thunderbolt held its own, using speed and firepower to intercept suicide aircraft before they could strike the fleet. The end of the war, the Jug's last roar. When the atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and Japan surrendered weeks later, the Thunderbolt had flown more missions in the Pacific than any other U.S. fighter except the P-40. For many pilots, their last memory of war was the growling rumble of a Jug engine cooling down on a coral strip, steam rising, oil dripping, gun barrels still warm. For some, that sound meant life. For others, victory. For all, it meant the end of the deadliest conflict in human history. The Jug's legacy in the Pacific. The P-47 left behind a legacy of unmatched ruggedness, fearsome ground attack power, reliable long-range performance, incredible dive speed, and pilot protection above all else. Thunderbolt pilots in the Pacific experienced the same truth as their brothers in Europe. The Jug was built to bring its pilot home. Whether flying over snow-covered Germany or steaming volcanic islands, whether facing flak batteries or kamikaze pilots, whether engaged in high-altitude combat or jungle strike missions, the Thunderbolt fought with the same defining trait: brutal, relentless durability. The war ends, but the Jug's legend doesn't. When World War II ended in August 1945, the P-47 Thunderbolt stood among the greatest combat machines ever built. It was the armored fist of the 8th Air Force, the hammer of the 9th Air Force, and the terror of ground forces from Normandy to Okinawa. Thousands of Thunderbolts had flown through the deadliest skies in human history and returned with scars and stories that would define aviation engineering for decades. But victory raised new questions. What happens to a machine built for war when the world suddenly shifts toward peace? Does the fighter fade away? Does it evolve? Or does it find new purpose in a world reshaped by the dawn of the nuclear age? The answer, as with everything involving the Thunderbolt, was more complex and more powerful than anyone expected. The Great Demobilization. What do we do with all these airplanes? After VJ Day, the U.S. Army Air Forces faced a monumental problem. They had over 40,000 aircraft, dozens of major overseas airfields, hundreds of thousands of airmen, and rapidly shrinking budgets. A massive demobilization began. B-17s were flown to storage sites in the desert. P-38 Lightnings were scrapped for aluminum. Entire groups were deactivated in weeks. But not the P-47. The Jug was too valuable, too tough, too versatile, and too respected by the men who had flown and maintained it. The Air Technical Service Command had already studied combat-damaged P-47s in Europe and the Pacific. Reports described the aircraft as exceptionally survivable, highly maintainable in field conditions, an ideal platform for developing nations without advanced industrial support. Simply put, the Jug still had work to do. The Thunderbolt in occupation duty, a peacemaker in a broken world. In the immediate aftermath of the war, vast regions of Europe and Asia were starving, shattered, or under political transition. The U.S. needed aircraft to patrol occupied Germany and Japan, escort transport convoys, provide quick response support, and enforce no-fly zones over areas vulnerable to unrest. Jets existed now. The P-80 Shooting Star had entered service, but early jet engines were thirsty, fragile, and unreliable. They couldn't operate from rough airstrips or maintain long patrol times. The Thunderbolt could. Between 1945 and 1947, P-47 units served in Germany, policing demilitarized zones. Japan, supporting occupation forces under MacArthur. Italy, monitoring political tensions during Reconstruction. The Philippines, assisting in counterinsurgency operations. Veterans noted that the P-47's mere presence often defused conflict. As one officer said, people knew what the Jug could do. Nobody wanted to be on the wrong end of 8 Brownings. The Thunderbolt in foreign service. The world adopts the Jug, with the U.S. shifting rapidly to jet fighters. Many P-47s were transferred to Allied nations rebuilding their air forces. These weren't cast-off machines. They were combat-proven warhorses, valued especially by countries dealing with rugged terrain, hot climates, and limited infrastructure. Countries that operated the P-47 after World War II included Brazil, Mexico, France, Italy, Iran, Turkey, Yugoslavia, Portugal, Colombia, Venezuela, Dominican Republic, Nicaragua. Some of these air forces kept their Thunderbolts flying into the late 1950s. For them, the Jug was perfect, cheap to maintain, nearly impossible to kill, ideal for ground attack, flexible across missions. Brazil's Thunderbolts. Brazilian P-47s became famous during the Italian campaign, and after the war, Brazil adopted them as frontline fighters for years. One Brazilian pilot said in an interview decades later, "We would fly them through rainstorms that broke lighter aircraft." The Jug just shrugged. The Dominican Republic's Thunderbolts. The Dominican Air Force became the last military in the world to operate P-47s in active service, well into the 1960s. They used the Jug as a frontline fighter long after jets dominated the skies. It outlived many of the aircraft that were originally designed to replace it. The Thunderbolt in the early Cold War, an old warrior in a new world. The Cold War introduced a new strategic environment: nuclear weapons, long-range bombers, high-speed jets, and political uncertainty. The U.S. Air Force, created in 1947, focused on nuclear deterrence, jet technology, strategic bombing, but in regions like the Balkans, the Middle East, Latin America, and Southeast Asia, what was needed wasn't a nuclear-capable jet. What was needed was a tough, low-maintenance, reliable ground attack fighter. Once again, the P-47 answered the call. Counterinsurgency. Throughout the late 1940s, Thunderbolts were used in anti-guerrilla operations, border patrols, coastal defense, armed reconnaissance. Their rugged radial engines handled dust, mud, and heat in ways early jets simply couldn't. Escort and patrol. Before the F-86 Sabre and other advanced jets were widely deployed, P-47s escorted transport, VIP aircraft, reconnaissance flights, and supply missions, training future pilots. Many newly formed air forces used Thunderbolts to train their first generation of fighter pilots. The Jug wasn't just a weapon, it was a schoolmaster. The men who flew the Jug after the war. War creates veterans. Peace creates survivors. In the years after World War II, P-47 pilots found themselves in an unusual emotional space. They were grateful to be alive, but struggled to adjust to civilian life. Many kept flying. Some became airline pilots. Some joined the reserves. Some became instructors. Others drifted away from aviation entirely. But all of them remembered the Jug. She was the aircraft that forgave your mistakes. Pilots recalled the sense of confidence the Thunderbolt gave them. They spoke of wounds survived because the armor held, engines that kept turning with holes in them, controls that still responded when half-severed, hard landings that would have crushed lighter fighters. One veteran said, "We always felt that if we could get back over friendly territory, the Jug would take us home." Reunions. In the 1970s, Thunderbolt pilot reunions became more common. Men who hadn't seen each other in decades embraced like brothers. They brought photo albums, maps, medals, but the centerpiece of every gathering was the story of the Jug. Someone always said, "Remember that one that came back full of holes?" And someone else always replied, "Which one?" There were dozens, but one mission, the one that forms the backbone of this documentary, stood above all others. The story of the Jug that should not have flown another mile, and yet flew hundreds. Engineering legacy. The Jug teaches the jets. When post-war engineers studied the P-47, they identified several lessons that directly shaped the design of early jets, including the F-84 Thunderjet, the F-86 Sabre, and even early attack aircraft like the A-1 Skyraider. 1. Build for damage tolerance. Even early jet fighters inherited the idea that pilots needed armored protection and systems redundancy. 2. Prioritize pilot survivability. Thunderbolt lessons influenced cockpit layout, oxygen systems, ejection seat design, fire suppression systems, emergency control backups. 3. Maintainability is combat power. Engineers emphasize that a frontline aircraft is only as good as its ground crew can keep it. The P-47 excelled here. Jets would need to follow suit. 4. The power of modular design. The Jug's easy-to-swap components inspired similar strategies in the F-84's engine bay, the F-80 SXS gun assembly panels, and later aircraft with standardized maintenance access. The Thunderbolt's lessons echoed for decades. The Jug in popular memory, the forgotten giant. Despite its extraordinary service record, the P-47 Thunderbolt is often overshadowed in popular culture by the elegant Spitfire, the sleek Mustang, the iconic Zero. The Jug was not beautiful, but it was beloved. Why isn't it more famous? Several reasons. The jet age arrived quickly, pushing piston fighters out of the spotlight. The Mustang had a better public relations image, connected to long-range escort and ace pilots. Movies and documentaries favored aircraft with sleek silhouettes. The P-47's greatness was technical, not glamorous. But among veterans, engineers, and historians, the truth is known. In terms of pure survivability and ground attack power, the P-47 had no equal. The fate of the miracle pilot, the pilot whose impossible mission anchors this documentary, returned home quietly after the war. He lived the kind of life millions of veterans lived. Marriage, children, a solid job, community involvement, reunions with his squadron when he could. He never considered himself a hero. He rarely spoke about the mission. But when he did, he said one thing consistently. It wasn't me. It was the aircraft. He lived into old age, surrounded by family and memories of a war fought long ago. When he passed, fellow veterans spoke not of medals or victories or the enemy he had faced, but of the day he refused to give up on a crippled Thunderbolt, and the Thunderbolt refused to give up on him. The true legacy of the P-47. Today, only a few dozen Thunderbolts still fly, painstakingly restored, cherished by collectors and museums, flown at air shows where the crowd hears that unmistakable roar and looks up in awe. Every one of those surviving aircraft carries the echo of stories like this one. Stories of courage, survival, engineering brilliance, and the bond between a pilot and his machine. The Jug is not remembered for elegance. It is remembered for strength, for grit, for the way it protected a generation of young men who fought in the most devastating conflict humanity has ever known. And for this truth, when everything went wrong, the Thunderbolt gave you a fighting chance. The last roar of a fading giant. Decades have passed since the roar of the P-47 Thunderbolt's radial engines shook the heavens over Europe and the Pacific. The airfields where they once lined the runways, wing to wing, nose to tail, are silent now. Hangars that once smelled of hot oil, gunpowder, and sweat sit quietly, reclaimed by grass and time. The pilots who flew them grew old. The mechanics grew older. And the world those men fought to save has changed in ways they could never have imagined. But one thing is not faded. Not the legend. Not the memory. Not the echo of the Jug. Because some stories refuse to die, and the Thunderbolt is one of them. Preserving the legacy, the Jugs that survived time. At museums around the world, the Thunderbolt sits in dim hangars under soft lights. Children run their fingers along the cold aluminum. Veterans stare at them silently, lost in memories. Each survivor tells a different chapter of the same story. AP-47D in England wears the markings of a squadron that escorted B-17s over Berlin. AP-47N in California carries the scars of ground attack missions on Okinawa. A weather Jug in Brazil still bears faint green paint from South American service. And scattered across Europe, on farms, near forests, in private collections, lie pieces of Thunderbolts that never returned. Shredded wings, bent propellers, armor plates, a torn patch of fuselage with .50 cal bullet holes punched clean through. These relics are reminders. The P-47 earned its legacy not by looking beautiful, but by refusing to die. The restorers, keeping the Jug alive. Restoring a Thunderbolt is an act of devotion. There are no easy manuals, no spare parts catalogs. Everything must be fabricated, reverse engineered, or rescued from scrapyards where the bones of old warboards rust quietly. Restorers describe the P-47 as both a challenge and a blessing. Its size allows for easier access to internal structures. Its rugged construction tolerates restoration better than lighter aircraft. Its systems, though complex, were built with field maintenance in mind. But they all talk about one thing: the moment the engine starts. The R-2800 radial engine doesn't simply start, it awakens. The sound is not a hum, not a whine, not a growl. It is a pulse, a deep, primal heartbeat, as though the aircraft itself remembers what it once was. Old men cry when they hear it. Children clap their hands. And everyone present, whether they understand the history or not, feels something ancient and powerful stirring in the air. The families, the men behind the machine. The most emotional part of the Thunderbolt's legacy is not found in museums or archives, but in living rooms across America, Europe, and Brazil. Inside boxes kept in closets for decades, families preserve. Faded photographs of young pilots in leather jackets. Flight logs stained with oil. Letters written in cramped handwriting. Medals earned in battles half a world away. And sometimes they share stories. A daughter remembers her father describing the cold over the North Sea. A grandson speaks of a man who woke from nightmares long after the war ended. A widow recalls her husband setting down his coffee one morning and quietly saying, "It wasn't me who survived. It was the aircraft. I was just along for the ride." The miracle mission, the Jug that returned from Germany torn apart, became a legend within these families. Some kept the story alive in whispers. Some never spoke of it at all, but the truth lived on in the silence. And every one of those stories is a thread in a larger tapestry of what the Thunderbolt truly represented. A promise to bring its pilot home. The historians, rewriting the place of the P-47. For decades, the P-51 Mustang dominated books, films, documentaries, and public imagination. It was fast, elegant, long-ranged, and unforgettable. But slowly, methodically, historians began revisiting the numbers. Sorties flown. Missions survived. Tonnage of bombs delivered. Enemies destroyed on the ground. Pilot survival rates. And they began to see a different picture. The Thunderbolt wasn't overshadowed. It was overlooked. One historian wrote, "If the P-51 won the sky, the P-47 won the ground. Together, they won the war." Modern scholars emphasize the Jug's role not just as a fighter, but as a tank buster, a train destroyer, a convoy killer, a flak suppressor, a guardian of bomber formations. and, above all, the most survivable fighter of its era. The mission at the heart of this documentary, the impossible return flight, became a case study in every aviation academy that examined World War II aircraft survivability. The pilot, the man who refused to give up. In the end, all the technology, steel, fuel, and firepower in the world come down to a single truth. Machines matter, but men matter more. The pilot from our story, bloodied, freezing, half-conscious yet determined, embodied that truth. He trusted the jug because he had to, and the jug, battered nearly to death, carried him because it could. He lived a long life after the war, not as a hero seeking recognition, but as a quiet reminder of what courage looks like when no one is watching. He never asked for fame, never tried to turn his story into glory, never pretended he was invincible. He simply told the truth. The aircraft saved me. But his squadron mates, long after the war, would gather around a table and say, "No, you save yourself." And the jug did the rest. The message left for the future. When the last Thunderbolt pilot dies, when the men who flew them are gone, what remains? Their stories, their lessons, their sacrifices, and the machines that carried them through hell and back. Future generations will not remember the exact design of the turbo supercharger or the thickness of the armor plate behind the cockpit, or the cubic inches of displacement in the R-2800 engine. They will remember something simpler, something deeply human. They will remember that in the darkest skies of human history, a group of very young men climbed into an enormous, angry machine made of aluminum and oil and fire, and trusted it with their lives. And that the machine, in turn, earned that trust. The final reflection, the echo in the sky. Imagine, for a moment, that winter day in 1944 once more. A wounded Thunderbolt limping through smoke and cloud. A pilot refusing to surrender. Black flak bursts tearing the sky apart. A German fighter on his tail. A freezing ocean waiting below. Controls almost dead. Fuel low. Hope fading. And yet, the jug keeps flying. The pilot keeps fighting. And together, against every law of physics and probability, they cross the sea. They touch the runway. They live. That moment, quiet, shuddering, miraculous, is the soul of the Thunderbolt. Not victory, not firepower, not kill counts, not fame. Survival. That is the final legacy of the P-47 Thunderbolt. It was the aircraft that refused to give up, and it taught a generation of pilots to never give up either. End of documentary. Thank you for accompanying this full, cinematic, long-form journey.